This is Chapter 5, Part 2. You should still have your Boy Who Harnessed the Wind electronic journal out, because you'll be able to finish and complete the problem and solution graphic organizer for this chapter. So, we finished with William and his family being very worried because they had to sell their goats to afford maize, which is corn that's used to produce a lot of different food for the people of Malawi. And William's very worried at this point because he doesn't know how long his family will last without food. I'm going to continue reading. Follow along with me. In early November, I started waking up as usual at 4 a.m. to make my ridges. On the first morning when I walked inside to have my breakfast, my father met me in the darkness. "No fala today," he said. "Huh? It's time to start cutting back. We need to save our food." By this time, our supply of maize was just 1.5 bags. Breakfast was first to go, and I wondered what would be next. But instead of complaining, I drank a big cup of water, grabbed my hoe, and went to meet Jeffrey in the fields. I told him about skipping breakfast. "Can you believe it?" I asked. But my cousin simply shrugged. "You're just starting that today?" he said. "I haven't had breakfast in 2 weeks. I'm getting used to it." In the early morning, the weather was still cool and I could dig my ridges with great energy. But by 7 a.m. my stomach had woken up and realized it was empty. It growled and rumbled and demanded to be filled. Soon the sun was high in the sky and sucking all of my strength. "Make those ridges better," he shouted. "But I'm too hungry, Papa." "Think about next year's harvest, son. Try your best." It was true. My ridges looked crooked, as if a slithering snake had dug them. Across the field, Jeffrey was hard at work. "Mr. Jeffrey," I called out, "you dig my ridges today and I'll dig yours tomorrow. Can we make this deal?" "I'll think about it," he said, gasping for breath. "That sounds like the same deal as yesterday." I was trying to raise my cousin's spirits. Ever since his father died, he hadn't been the same. He looked sad, and sometimes he stayed in his room for an entire day and didn't speak to anyone. He was also sickly. At a recent trip to the clinic, the doctor said he had anemia, which is caused by not having a healthy diet. I later discovered that breakfast wasn't the only thing Jeffrey was skipping. Food was running low all around. "I'm joking," I shouted. "But seriously, man, you don't look good. Take a break and get some rest." "I have no choice," he said, swinging his hoe. "You know my deal." I also knew that Jeffrey wouldn't be returning to school the next term. Because of the drought and losing her husband, Jeffrey's mother didn't have the money to pay his school fees. And anyway, she needed Jeffrey and his brother Jeremiah to work and provide food. That day, I pretended not to know. "Soon your man Kamkawamba will be in secondary school where he belongs," I said, "wearing trousers and walking tall." "He'll find us there," Jeffrey said. We older boys have plans for Kakawamba. "You can't touch him." "Oh, you wait and see." Jeffrey wasn't the only one changing. Kamba was also slowing down. I'd always known that his best years were behind him, back when he lived on the estate, but now his age was starting to show, and ever since the drought, he'd grown thinner. The food I was feeding him at night just wasn't enough, I guess. As he got slower, the mice in the fields outwitted him and other dogs beat him to the scraps in the garbage piles. Kamba no longer chased chickens around the courtyard, but stayed in the shade and slept. I was beginning to see his ribs. One night when I tossed up a ball of Nasima for him to eat, he lost sight of it, and it landed right on his head. "What's the problem, old man?" I teased. He leaned over and sucked down the food in one gulp. Some things didn't change. December arrived with dark skies and heavy rain. All across the region, farmers did their best to plant seed for the next harvest. Yet many had abandoned their fields in order to search for food. It wasn't long before their land was choked with weeds. My father managed to plant a small plot of maize, but without any fertilizer. He also found enough seed for a half-acre of tobacco, which would prove a lifesaver in the months to come. What began as drought and hunger in Malawi soon evolved into full-blown famine. That winter, it would tighten its grip until few people were left standing. Those looking for food began to cluster in the trading center and along the roads. Groups of men carrying their hoes went house to house asking for work, their clothes soaked from the rain and covered in mud. At each place they heard the same reply: "We have nothing to give." While the men searched for Ganyu, their wives gathered at the chief's house, where Gilbert passed out bags of flour at the door. Already hundreds of people had received food, and more kept coming. They carried children who cried from empty bellies, and some women were so weak that they fainted once they arrived. After Gilbert's mother nursed them back to health, they continued down the road in search of the next bite. The famine arrived at our door sooner than I imagined. During the second week of December, my mother milled our last pail of maize, giving us just 12 more meals. As soon as she left, I opened the storage room and peered inside. All that remained were empty bags piled in a corner like dirty laundry. I tried to remember what the room had looked like when it was full, but I just didn't have the energy. That night, my father called the family into the living room. "Given our situation," he said, "I've decided it's better if we go down to 1 meal per day. It's the only way we'll make it." My sisters and I argued over which meal would be. "We should have breakfast," said Aisha, who was 12. "I like lunch," shouted Doris. "No," my father said, "it will be supper. It's easier to keep your mind off hunger during the day, but no person should have to sleep with an empty stomach. We'll eat at night." My stomach was used to being fed every time it grumbled. Having no breakfast was one thing, but not eating breakfast or lunch was a lesson in patience and pain. It was even harder on my younger sisters, who didn't understand why no one would feed them. "Do you hear me, Mama?" they cried. "I'm hungry." "Yes, dear," my mother said. "I heard you. Just try to hold on." Dinner didn't come soon enough that first night. My father lit a lantern in the living room. We all gathered around watching the black soot spiral down the ceiling. As usual, we started with hand washing. My sister Doris walked around to each person and poured the warm water over their hands while they lathered up with soap and rinsed over the basin. When washing was finished, finally my mother fetched two bowls and lifted the lids. "Try to make it last," she said, and joined us on the floor. The first bowl contained Nasima, but instead of a mountain of steaming cakes, this was one gray blob. It didn't even look edible. In the second bowl, my mother had prepared a small portion of mustard greens. We passed the food around and didn't even bother using plates. The meal was over in minutes. With less than 1 pail of flour remaining, I knew that only a miracle could save us, or at least a very good idea. The next morning, my father announced his brilliant plan. "We're selling all of our food," he said. It didn't make sense to me. In fact, it seemed like the worst idea I've ever heard. But then he explained how we used the flour to make cakes to sell in the market. The extra money we earned would go toward buying more food. It was a huge gamble. That morning, my mother mixed the last of our flour with some soy powder and sugar and made zagumu cakes, which resembled small biscuits. The delicious smell of them baking over the fire drifted through the sheets of rain and onto the road, stopping the Ganyu men in their tracks. Even the birds became brave and gathered outside the kitchen to sing a woeful tune. The aroma seemed to enter my body like a spirit, slithering into my empty belly and stretching its arms and legs. Normally, when my mother made zagumu cakes, she let me scrape the bowl with my fingers. In Malawi, this was such a cherished privilege that kids had given it a name, VP, after Vipassi pot, meaning the bottom of the pot. "Mama, VP?" we asked, our eyes round with anticipation. But this time was different. Mother used every last drop of batter as if wiping it clean with a sponge. No VP, only empty pot. That night my father made a stand from a broken table and an iron sheet. My mother opened for business the following morning, selling her cakes 3 kwacha each. The cakes were heavy and lasted longer in the belly than some of the cheap breads for sale in the market. If a person didn't have enough money to buy flour, the cakes were their only option. That first day, she sold out in less than 20 minutes. During these hard times, everyone learned the lesson of supply and demand. The rule of economics say that whenever the supply of something is great, say that farmers have a good crop, the demand will be low, and so will the price. But when it's the opposite, when the supply is low, like it was during the famine, the demand is overwhelming and the prices soar into the heavens. Ever since the country ran out of maize, businessmen had been traveling into neighboring countries like Tanzania and buying it by the truckful. Back in Wimbe Market, they raised the price, partly because gasoline was expensive and sometimes the trucks broke down. But also, they charged more because they knew people were starving and would pay anything to stay alive. Luckily, one of the traders, Mr. Mangochi, was my father's friend and agreed to cut us a deal. For the money my mother earned selling cakes, Mangochi sold her another pail of maize. My mother took it to the mill, saving half the flour for more cakes, while the other half went to us. It was just enough to provide our blob of Nasima each night, plus some pumpkin or mustard leaves as relish. It didn't erase our hunger, but knowing our one meal was safe made it seem less painful. As long as we can stay in business, we can make it through, my father told us. Our profit is that we stay alive. A couple weeks later, my mother was coming home from the market when a giant truck passed her on the road. Its load was covered with tarps. Some of the other traders said it was maize. "They're taking it to the government store in Chamama," someone told her. When my mother got home, she called me over and explained the news. "You will go to Chamama tomorrow. Leave as early as possible." Chamama was 12 miles away, so of course I grumbled. "Are you sure it was maize and not fertilizer? Because I heard that. Are you listening to me, boy?" My mother snapped. She did not like her children talking back, especially not now. "You go tomorrow." My mother was right. It was great news. It meant the government had found surplus maize, perhaps from Tanzania, and would sell it for a discount. With prices climbing higher and higher in the market, it was the only way we could get ahead. The next morning I awoke at 5 a.m. and set off on my bicycle for Chamama. An empty flour sack fluttered from my handlebars, and as I rattled down the narrow dirt roads, I noticed many others carrying the same. "Chamama?" I asked them. They replied, nodding. The government store was located in the central market. When I finally arrived, I saw the lines of people stretched from the door all the way down the road, longer than 2 soccer fields. One line was for men, while the other was for women and children. Each was getting longer by the minute, so I parked my bike against a fence and took my place among the men. A cool breeze blew from the lake and kept people in good spirits. But once the scorching sun rose in the sky, the hunger revealed itself in everyone. People suddenly appeared exhausted, as if they hadn't slept in days. The skin around their faces was shrunken, and their eyes squinted against the hard light. It had probably been weeks since many had eaten a proper meal, and the government store was their last and only hope of survival. As the sun rose hotter, they grew more and more feeble. The man in front of me could hardly stay awake. His hands were trembling as if he were cold, and his breathing was heavy and loud. When the lion started to move, he couldn't keep his balance and fell down. To my horror, no one helped him up, just simply stepped over him. In the next line, babies cried from hunger, and children tugged at their mothers' dresses. If there's one thing I'll remember most about the day in Chamama, it's the sound of crying babies. After several hours in line, people got restless and angry. Angry at the sun, and at the people pressed all around whose starvation reeked of soured rags. Angry at the government, at the dust, and at the very air that occupied the emptiness of their stomachs. As we inched closer and closer to the door, their impatience took control. People began to push. Someone shoved me so hard in the back that I grabbed hold of the man in front of me to keep from falling down. A few boys from the end of the line then raced toward the front, squirming into the crowd like mice under a door. "Hey, stop cutting!" people shouted. "We've been here since dawn!" But they kept coming. Everyone knew that at some point the grain would run out, and no one wanted to be the loser left holding an empty sack. The more people cut in line, the more others panicked. Suddenly, both lines surged toward the front doors at once. The wave of bodies lifted me off the ground and carried me forward. I felt the air being squeezed out of my lungs and saw the sky disappear above me. I was being swallowed by this enormous, terrifying mob, and I was helpless against it. "Hey, stop!" I shouted. "I can't breathe!" But it was no use. The mob trapped me in its belly. A strange thing happened. Everything went dark. The screams and moaning of children fell away. The shouting vanished. I drifted in slow motion as if underwater. For a second, I thought that maybe I was already dead, and a small part of me even felt relieved. But no. Through the cracks in the crowd, I saw the government building, now closer than ever. The crowd had carried me forward like a cyclone. I managed to plant my feet back on the ground and slither between the bodies. It helped being skinny. A minute later, I reached the front of the pack and stood on the porch building. Then, I slipped through the doors. And that is where we're going to stop at Chapter 5, Part 2. Fill in anything that you learned into your graphic organizer, and then tomorrow you will begin reading Chapter 5, Part 3, that will conclude Chapter 5.